There are criminals who act out of chaos. And then there are those who believe they are order itself. Ted Bundy was not a monster hiding in the dark. He was a mirror, polished carefully, held up to society, and for a long time, society nodded back. This is not a story about evil as spectacle. This is an autopsy of a mind that mistook control for identity and intelligence for immunity. Listen closely, because the most dangerous thing about Ted Bundy was never what he did. It was what he believed about himself. Childhood, the birth of a fracture. Ted Bundy's childhood was quiet, and that was the problem. No dramatic abuse, no obvious cruelty. Nothing that fits neatly into the story people want to tell themselves about where monsters come from. He was born into ambiguity, raised believing his mother was his sister, his grandparents, his parents. This is not a detail. This is the crack. Identity, for a child, is not philosophical. It is structural. It is the floor beneath your feet. And Ted's floor was a lie. When the truth surfaced, it did not arrive as clarity. It arrived as humiliation, without language. Psychologically, this matters more than pain. Pain can be processed. Shame cannot, unless it is transformed. Ted learned early that reality could be rewritten if you were convincing enough. He was not emotionally expressive. He was observant. He watched how people responded, how admiration worked, how attention could be engineered. Children like Ted don't explode. They organize. They learn that if the inner world feels unstable, the outer world must be controlled. This is where the myth begins, not the myth of violence, but the myth of exceptionalism. Ted didn't think, "I am broken." He thought, "I am different." And difference, when paired with intelligence, easily mutates into entitlement. Adulthood, constructing the mask. Ted Bundy did not drift through life. He constructed it. Law school, political volunteering, charm deployed like a tool, not a trait. This is where most people misunderstand him. He did not want chaos. He wanted legibility. To be seen, admired, validated by systems that mattered. His relationships were not about intimacy. They were about reflection. Other people existed to confirm the version of Ted that Ted wanted to believe in. Psychologically, this is narcissistic scaffolding. Not arrogance, but dependence on external confirmation. Inside, there was no stable self, only a performance that had to be maintained. Every success reinforced the delusion. I am smarter than the rules. I am above consequence. I am entitled to my impulses. This is where the danger grows. Because when identity is built on control, any threat becomes intolerable. Rejection wasn't painful to Ted. It was annihilating. And annihilation demands correction. The shadow self. Lies, lures, and rationalization. Ted Bundy did not see himself as violent. That is not denial. That is reframing. In his mind, actions were detached from identity. What he did was separate from who he was. This dissociation allowed him to function in daylight while descending at night. He did not hunt in rage. He selected. Vulnerability was not emotional to him. It was logistical. Every interaction followed an internal script. Can this person be guided? Can this situation be controlled? Can risk be minimized? After each act, there was no cinematic remorse. There was assessment. What worked? What failed? What needed refinement? This is the most chilling aspect. Not cruelty, but administration. Ted told himself stories. Stories where he was not a predator, but a man responding to impulse, to stress, to circumstances. This is how morality collapses, not all at once, but by delegation. Responsibility is outsourced. Empathy is muted. The self remains intact, or so he believes. But control always demands escalation, because what once satisfied eventually becomes insufficient, and the mask begins to crack. The collapse, when control turns against him. Ted Bundy was never afraid of being evil. He was afraid of being ordinary. And being caught meant one thing above all others. The story was no longer his to tell. Arrest did not shatter him immediately. In fact, at first, it energized him. This is a pattern seen in individuals who confuse intelligence with invulnerability. When pressure increases, they don't retreat. They perform harder. Ted believed he could still outthink the system, out-talk it, outmaneuver it. He treated the investigation like a game of angles and optics, which detail to deny, which truth to bend, which silence to weaponize. Psychologically, this is not confidence. It is narcissistic survival. When the external world finally pushes back, the narcissistic mind does not ask, "What did I do?" It asks, "How dare they misunderstand me?" Ted did not feel fear in the conventional sense. He felt offense. Offense that his intelligence was being questioned. Offense that authority dared to corner him. Offense that the narrative was slipping. This is when cracks began to appear. Not panic, but rigidity. His thinking narrowed. His justifications repeated themselves. He began circling the same arguments, the same explanations. This is a psychological signal. When a mind built on control loses flexibility, collapse is no longer sudden. It becomes inevitable. Courtroom, confinement, and the final illusion. Ted Bundy believed the courtroom was a stage. He believed the audience mattered more than the verdict. This tells us everything. Rather than seeking resolution, he sought recognition. Rather than accountability, he sought presence. He spoke not to confess, but to curate. Every statement was calculated to preserve the last remaining illusion, that he was still exceptional. Psychologically, this is where many expect remorse to appear. It did not. Remorse requires connection. Connection requires vulnerability. And vulnerability, to Ted, was annihilation. He did not grieve the harm caused. He grieved the loss of control. When people looked at him and no longer saw charm, but threat, that was the true punishment. In confinement, the noise disappeared. No audience, no leverage. Only time. And time is dangerous for a mind that survives on stimulation and dominance. Accounts from this period show no spiritual awakening, no emotional reckoning. Instead, we see emptiness exposed. When stripped of manipulation, Ted Bundy was not tormented. He was hollow. This is perhaps the most disturbing truth. Not rage, not agony, but absence. The end. What remained when everything was gone. As the end approached, Ted Bundy did not transform. There was no dramatic reversal, no sudden moral clarity. Those who expect redemption misunderstand the structure of his mind. Redemption requires an intact conscience. His was never fully formed. In his final phase, Ted spoke more freely. Not out of guilt, but because the stakes were gone. There was nothing left to protect. What emerged was not honesty, but detachment. The same detachment that allowed him to live divided for so long. At the very end, control did not save him. Intelligence did not save him. Charm did not save him. because none of those things were ever foundations. They were tools, and when the tools were gone, there was no self underneath them. Ted Bundy is often remembered as a symbol of evil. That is convenient and dangerously incomplete. He was not chaos. He was calculation without conscience. He was what happens when intelligence is detached from empathy, when identity is built on dominance, and when control becomes the substitute for meaning. The lesson is not fear. The lesson is recognition. Because minds like this do not announce themselves. They blend, they adapt, they perform, and they only become visible when the damage is already done. In the next episode, Jeffrey Dahmer. When isolation becomes obsession, and loneliness corrodes the boundary between fantasy and reality.